Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining us for this fourth Forum for Peace. And in the very program of this forum, the history of Normandy is inextricably linked to the idea of peace and human rights, as this forum has proved over the years. And this debate today, putting peace to the test, is going to bring a reflection and an exchange on the tensions in our world, or past tensions in the world, and possibly future tensions. And we'll try to create a perspective between these tensions, between these ideas, and the putting peace to the test debate is part of a general conference on why is peace eluding us, and so it is because peace cannot be decreed or it can be governed as in the past, and through large-scale diplomatic conferences, summits. All this has shown limitations, and within this debate, in partnership with INA, that the National Institute that keeps the televisual and media heritage of France, we will reflect on these issues, and we will try to see what these moments have hidden, what these moments of peacemaking has created, their limitations. So we have episodes that you can see on the side of the forum and on the INA website. And that web series of 8 little films on why does peace elude us can of course enlighten a number of themes, and we're going to talk about these issues with Maximo, who's a journalist. He was a reporter in the Balkans, he was a reporter in Iraq, he worked on diplomacy as a journalist, he was working for Libération and Le Monde, and now he's is an editor at Le Monde, in charge of the debate and ideas section. And then there's a very nice article in Le Monde today in Le Monde Diplomatique today on peace. To my left, Bertrand Badi. Bertrand Badi is a lecturer at Sciences Po. He has written many books on international security, or on various books on global diplomacy, but many books by Bertrand Badi, so a serial writer who is also the advisor in terms of science and education for this series and history. And the web series was directed by Michael Garmrasny. We'll go back with Michael on his work, on all the reflections that this has generated for him. Michael, he's a history teacher in the secondary school. He's also a historian. He's worked on the Algerian War, on the history of the Harki, and he has directed very certainly noticeable and noticed documentaries, the Apocalypse series that was shown on national TV, and was part of the millions of French people who watched these documentaries on prime time. Garmrasny has directed this web series, and he'll be talking to us via Zoom, because he's presenting a documentary, a feature film documentary in Paris, and we want to thank him for being with us today. Michael, good afternoon. First question on this series. You tend to direct very long documentaries. What was noticeable for you when you directed these short episodes? Good afternoon. So can you hear me? Yep. First, I want to apologize for not being able to 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 be present, and but I had to be with French television to show my next documentary. But yes, I tend to work on longer formats. The film that I'm finishing is 5 episodes of 50 minutes. Here we have only 4-minute episodes, so it's a different exercise. You need to be really synthetic to highlight the very salient elements of a period, of an era, the various people and characters on these moments where peace was expected to arise after meetings of these leaders. So we had to try to put pictures to that with a simple commentary that would be understandable by all. So it was a bit of a challenge. We tried to rise to that challenge. I also wanted to ask to talk to Maximo. We'll talk about peace, peace agreements, peace accords, peace treaties. So that first question, how does one define peace? It's very difficult. Peace is like a suspended dream. That's what Kofi Annan has said, the former General Secretary of the UN and Nobel Prize for Peace. And it's something that he said a few days after the September 11 attacks. So peace is fragile, yes. It is always threatened, always under threat, and it's as difficult to build as to preserve. And so it's not only the images of the great international meetings or these handshakes and the hopes generated by these meetings, by these conferences, especially for winners. Because when there's a treaty after a conflict, it is something that that makes real, if you like, or that is following what the situation on the ground, and if you go to the French National Library, you can see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of treaties, all the treaties that France is keeping basically as a notary, and that treaty room, as it's called, is something that calls for humility, because we can see that in our long history, the moments of peace have been extremely brief compared to the phases of war, and peace, which is considered as a sovereign good, is something that is very hard to define. Raymond Aron, the philosopher, said it's a more or less durable suspension of the rivalry between political units. And so he defined 3 types of peace: the peace of balance between powers, powers of equivalent force; the peace of hegemony, when one power is dominating others; and the peace of empire, when the most powerful power is above all else. The Pax Romana, for instance, with the Roman Empire, is the peace of empire. The Vienna conflict in 1815, after the fall of Napoleon, is a peace of balance, and it was something that failed after the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles. And it was a meeting, it was a conference in Versailles where people said this will never happen again. And Wilson, the American president, was received as a messiah, and said there'd be no more secret diplomacy, there'd be 14 points to the treaty and so forth. But that peace was humiliating to Germany, and explains what happened afterwards, and created conditions that led to the Second World War. And it is after, drawing lessons from the failure of Versailles, of the failure of the Society of Nations, the League of Nations, that the UN system was created, and is a system that tries to rule international relations and has managed to avoid major conflicts in Europe by trying to reconstruct the Western Europe and the balance of terror between the United States and the USSR has managed to avoid major conflicts in Europe. So one can reach peace for a while after a conflict, but it is rarer. And if you look at international law, there a lot of things have been written on war, on the right to war, or war law, if you like, or law during the war, but there is nothing, or it's only starting on the after-war peace, or after-war law, the peace law. How does one reconstruct? How does one repair? So the crucial question of justice. How can one construct peace? And it is even more complicated today because there are very few very few open conflicts between states. But most conflicts are partly civil wars or things happening within a state, which makes things a lot more complicated in terms of reconstruction or reparation, or for the durable durable peace. We can say that in the Balkans, there's no more war in the Balkans, but nothing has been settled. And the notion of peace is even more difficult to define. We're in a very chaotic world. We're in a world where a number of powers want to question the international status quo, China or Russia, and these countries who are rivals, who are threats to each other, are also economic partners, or partners for the big challenges that humanity is faced with. Climate change, for instance. So the situation has changed. Wars are now hybrid, the grey zones, cyber wars, operations like the Russians did in Korea. So war is not clear, and peace isn't clear either. We're in the grey zones, and it makes it even more difficult to define what peace is. So we'll see the first episode on Potsdam very shortly, but Bertrand Madi, peace, is it difficult to define? Yes, I agree with what Marc has just said. There was an amazing challenge in the films that you're going to see. Can one film peace? Can one have an image of peace? And I'm not a specialist of the image or film, but I was very excited about this challenge, because peace, because there are a lot of traps in peace, so to speak. And the challenge to the filmmaker was, are these documentaries that you're going to see have managed to go beyond those traps? The first trap, peace can't be formal, but we have a lot of images of handshakes and treaties being signed, pens signing peacefully on pieces of paper, of state leaders embracing and so forth. But one can see that most of the time there's no effect to that, which leads me to my second point, which makes the task even more difficult. What is a peace worth if the people, society, doesn't want to follow, doesn't agree? And we know that the leaders of this world, accustomed by centuries of history that went in that direction, so the leaders of this world think that peace or war belongs to them. War, before, and Marc Semo said, is right when he says that first we define war, and then we try to define peace. For for princes and kings, war was like just a tournament, if you like, a tourney between cousins. So basically, kings and princes, who were all part of the same family in Europe, would wage war in the winter, and then would probably spend the summer together. And at the time, and it's important to understand that war was not war would create famines maybe, or disease, or but not a lot of destruction and not a lot of death. So war was not affecting society so much. What happened on the battlefield, from Bouvines to Fontenoy, it was just it had nothing to do with world wars. 13 million deaths in the First World War, 60 million in the Second. But then one day, after the French Revolution, societies basically took hold of wars, decided to make wars their own. So with those French soldiers who left in search of freedom to fight against the enemies of France and so forth. So it was a social war. And then there were social wars. Decolonization wars are social wars because it didn't start from an organized army, but from volunteers, from people who were resisting. And today's wars in the Sahel, in the Yemen, or in Afghanistan are societal wars. So what are worth these negotiations or these handshakes if society doesn't want to follow suit? How does one follow the construction of peace by society? So that leads me to my third point. And those of you who were here this morning have heard it before. Today's peace is a social peace. It's a matter of behavior. It's a village in Mali where survival is at stake. It's a population, it's an Afghani population that's deprived of everything, and you know that in Afghanistan, every third one Afghani in three doesn't is hungry or is not eating enough. So peace goes through individuals, and there can be a lot of talks in embassies or in governments. If people don't want peace or want peace, then whatever you think doesn't matter. And if a French politician says one does not negotiate with jihadists, what do you see in reality? Hundreds of micro-negotiations between village leaders and violence mongers, if you like. And these micro-negotiations become an element of the dialectics of peace and war, while government decisions or president's decisions have no impact whatsoever. And one rediscovers or discovers that the real actor of peace is a local actor who is trying to survive and help his loved ones survive, not wanting to win elections, just to survive. And that peace, we have the feeling that it's slipping between our fingers. It's hard to photograph it. And let's see if we have been able to film it. So that'll be the first episodes, 1945, and Churchill, Truman, Stalin meeting to turn a new page after the Second World War. So first video clip of that web series.
After 6 years' war against Germany, Europe is in ruins. In Potsdam, the winners of World War II are presented together before hundreds of cameramen and photographs. The conference will share the planet in different areas of influence, and on July the 23rd, 45, British Churchill, American Truman, and the Russian dictator Stalin agree on world peace through a handshake. Can it resist to the challenges? Two weeks later, after the insistence of Japanese in pursuing combats, the US dropped 2 atomic charges on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The handshake goes down and the US is bumping its chest after the race they will pursue against USSR. Within 3 years, the Great Alliance has been forgotten, and allies from yesterday are now new enemies. It's the start of the Cold War. An iron curtain is falling on Europe. An iron curtain Two blocks are facing each other. In the West, Europe is rebuilding. With the issues of economic needs in Europe, great programs of modernization, extension of its agriculture and industry are bringing some solutions. In the East, new walls are being built to lock up people. Heroes and athletes are exploited by propaganda. And instead of peace, this is a new type of war, much less cold than thought, the Korea War. The UN forces have crossed the 30th parallel between the two Koreas. The Cuba crisis in 1962. The world is on the verge of nuclear war, threatened by 2/3 of the US territory. In 1975, the Vietnam War, after 2 decades of horror, is coming to an end after large pacifist marches. Peace right now. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, the march is pushing to the end, and in 1989, what's left of the New World promised in Potsdam 45 years before, it crumbles at the same time of the Berlin War, and the peace of leader is now making space for the people's peace. Potsdam 1945, one of the 8 episodes of this web series directed by Ina and the Forum for Peace. Michael Kamrasny, you are the director of this web series. Let's go back to the heart of our debate, putting peace to the test. And this observation at the end of this first episode, peace of leaders is making way for peace of the peoples. So Potsdam was a will of the peoples or of the leaders, Michael? What I can tell you, I can refer to with what Mr. Badi said. This is the issue of the series. It's a political gesture, which translated into a handshake, one of the leaders. It's a choice of the king. They're gathering to determine how they conceive peace. It's clearly a scene which is present in all strong handshakes in history, which is very mediatic for the 20th century. These moments couldn't happen without cameras, photographers, or even an audience. And behind this scenery, which is imposing something strong, striking, an image which we all keep in mind. We all remember this Potsdam meeting, a strong moment with three leaders at the end of the war, a terrible war. So everybody's waiting for a new world. You didn't have to wait for a COVID-19 pandemic to wait for a new world. Well, it's the case here. And after this political moment, people realize that the expected world is not one that they dreamt of, and that the image was stronger than the actual reality was supposed to cover. With regards to Potsdam, it's a political gesture, which is an introduction to the Cold War. This moment, supposed to be a new world, reconciliation around the three leaders, actually makes space to this incredible moment that is the Cold War 3 years later. And as Raymond Aron said, an impossible peace and an unlikely war. And I will add to this episode that the war is actually much less cold than we thought. This saying of an impossible peace and an unlikely war comes from a European perspective, but it was absolutely not a Cold War. It was a permanent conflict. And to conclude, the Vietnam War is a key moment, a strong moment where the people, including the American people, but not only, marched, expressed how they hated the situation and pressured the leaders to stop this war provoked by leaders, at least partly. Thank you, Michael. Bertrand Badi? Yes, for our students present here, do you know how many died during the Cold War? 36 million people. Almost 3 times more than the First World War. And as it was explained, not only Europe was involved. So this was a moment of extreme tensions, but also extreme violence all around Europe, on the other continents, mainly Asia and later Africa. But also because words are a trap. Words and images. When you see that famous handshake, and this was very rightly said in the movie, that we didn't know we were so close from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what are those events? An assault against the Japanese people, of course, but most importantly, an American assault against Stalin, showing that if the Japanese war lasted too long, then USSR would get involved and they would have to be tipped or thanked. Therefore, it would be a loss for the American influence and the Western influence. So you can see here how this handshake often has an aggressive objective. This is why people should be cautious. And if you look at different agreements, I'm not sure we'll see the film about the Oslo agreements. It was the exact same. Making peace to better make war. And that's a clear rationale. And I can only commend this film, which shows that societies must follow after peace. And it was little shown how much the Cold War structured societies, and then the societies decided when the Cold War should stop. It was not a strategic movement. The Cold War stopped when the societies expressed themselves, just like the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War stopped due to the pressure of the American public opinion. I will actually defend the contradictory argument talking about Europe. Potsdam is less remembered as Yalta. But the idea was to create a different Europe. At the time, on paper, people were very optimistic. There will be democratic elections everywhere. That was the idea that was clearly mentioned. There were influence areas, of course, but the obligation to organize elections, to create governments, to create a space in Europe. And the legal framework of Potsdam was the one that helped make peace with Germany, the real peace, which was signed in September 1990. And that's in September 1990, as part of this framework set up by Potsdam, that the German reunion took place. And what's hidden by this handshake, and I agree with Bertrand and with the film, this handshake was hiding another type of violence, even in Europe. For Stalin, with the Red Army, it was still the Soviet repression. And behind Potsdam, which was accepted by the Allies, was to push away the Germans from all Eastern Europe territories. That was an ethnic cleansing of dozens of millions of people, and that was the lesson learned from Versailles. As Churchill said cynically, in 1918, we tried to coincide borders with peoples. Here it's the opposite. And because of the questions raised by German minorities, le micro est coupé, l'interprétation n'est pas possible sans micro. You mentioned the French-German friendship mark, and as part of those 8 episodes, one shows an agreement that seems to have worked. We won't be able to show it, but that's one of the 8 episodes, sealing the French-German friendship, which we will feed during many years. Bertrand Badi, at the time, it was a symbol. There were also interests. But as you said, peace needed support as part of this German-French friendship. We can say it worked quite well. Well, you saw it if you were present during this morning's session around the French-German reconciliation. There was a political will, strong political will, which was this meeting between Eisenhower and Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle could negotiate his war leader role to legitimate this reconciliation with Germany. But we know, who live in those societies, we know that the actual success of the French-German reconciliation was not political choices, but rather societies who learned to live together. And that's where the extraordinary change takes place. With my parents, you should avoid talking about Germany back then and remember this beautiful song from Georges Brassens, I don't know if you remember it, about Germans and French. Your children will make love together, hand in hand, in tomorrow's Europe. And this great poem from Georges Brassens referred to this phenomenon, which I would say is quite remarkable and new in human history. That is, 2 people who used to fight each other for centuries, who created a social link incredibly fast. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the foundation of international peace. That's not the UN stage or organizations, governments, or embassies. What is truly fundamental is this social link. And what's going on? Micro-sociology of peace is this, creating this social link. There is no micro-sociology of peace. It doesn't exist. Micro-sociology of peace is individuals, a young German person coming to study as part of the Erasmus program in Caen, Strasbourg, or elsewhere, or a young French person doing an internship in Germany, etc., who meets a partner or a German boyfriend or girlfriend who get together, work together. I was lucky enough to write 3 books with a German colleague. That's what peace is all about. Just to express a paradox, while this is true, because it's an example of peace done by societies, French people speak much less German classes at school, for example, as compared to what was done between both world wars, or much less than before the First World War, because while Germany was an enemy, you had to get prepared. De Gaulle spoke quite well German, actually. It was normal. That was the enemy, and you had to learn the language. Now, the reconciliation was such a model that it just makes sense now. But when the wall fell, it was interesting to see that for older leaders like Mitterrand, there was a moment about what the reconciliation meant. The true hereditary enemy was actually the British. But the memory of wars with Germany was such that somebody like Mitterrand was quite reluctant. Well, the debate is open now. Let me remind you that you will be able to ask questions at the end of the debate. In just a moment, we will turn to Washington to watch another international meeting, that is Carter and Deng Xiaoping, which will be the opening of China to the Western world, and maybe the opposite in a way. A new economic alliance with the US, which will also start another type of war, a trade war. That is the 3rd episode of the web series. Let's watch it together. The 1979 meeting in Washington between the American president and Japan.
In Washington, out of a black Cadillac with Chinese American flags, a short, jovial man comes out. Deng Xiaoping is received by President Jimmy Carter. 29th of January 1979, Communist China opens to the West after having been closed for 30 years. Behind the martial appearance of that meeting, it's peace that is celebrated, but peace will put to the test. The change in China comes from a number of decisive events. The end of the Vietnam War that was opposing indirectly Chinese and American troops. The death, 3 years earlier, of the great helmsman Mao. The remains of the president are being shown in the Hall of the People, but also the rift between China and the USSR, who are contesting the leadership of the communist world. China and its 800 million people exist legally for America. Called the Man of the Year by Time magazine, Deng Xiaoping decides to unite, to ally with America instead of with Russia. And after that, and through trade, China will become a giant global with a double-digit growth rate. And it's success that leads to possible future change and maybe democratic change. However, on the 4th of June 1999, on the Tiananmen Square in Beijing, shows that this will not be the case. The police terror has started. While still being communist, China has been able to adapt to the capitalist market by becoming a market of production and a market of consumption. And after the Cold War, it comes out on top by inventing a form of mixed economy and becomes a competitor to America. Lenovo has just bought the computer branch of IBM and becomes the third computer company in the world. In 2018, after protectionist measures ordered by Donald Trump, China and the US are contesting for the first place in world economy. And 40 years after that peace concluded in Washington, the trade war has only just started. And the Chinese want to topple the Europeans in every domain. There are Chinese cars, there are Chinese trains, they have their own TGV, and are trying to put a foot or to set a foot in the United States. Maximo, it's an incredible image. China is awakening, as Alain Perfit used to say. China is opening up, but it's an avalanche that takes place afterwards. These images show peace, but it's a strategic masterpiece, because the recognition of China was first from Nixon in 1972. There were 14 visits to China, but it was the first time in 1979. It was the first time that Deng Xiaoping, who's number 2 in China, came to the United States, but he was a real thinker. He was a pragmatist, and he said it doesn't matter if a cat is white or black. All that matters is that it catches mice. But the real aim of that meeting was not peace; it was an alliance against the USSR. And the first meeting didn't take place at the White House. The first meeting took place at the home of Brzezinski, who was the advisor for national security, and who was not as famous as Carter, but who was a very clever man. And what the Americans were saying through that is that they were creating an alliance with China against the USSR. And Deng Xiaoping used to say, Vietnam is the Cuba of the East. And 2 weeks after that meeting, China attacked Vietnam. The Americans don't say anything. And the film shows very well that that was the start of the growth of the Chinese economy. But it shows how peace, or a symbolic gesture of peace, can hide a much more offensive, attacking vision of things. But it was very, very hard. It was really, really difficult for Michael to summarize so many events in 4 minutes. Bertrand Badi, what Michael shows in this episode is that a number of conditions are being fulfilled. The Vietnam War is over. China needs the United States. The United States needs China to try to create a crack in the Iron Curtain. Not only to continue the idea of the trap. We saw the handshake between Carter and Deng. We could have seen the handshake between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai, a very important name, a great prime minister of China, the real thinker of contemporary China, more than Mao, He was the symbol of mobilization, if you like. And a small anecdote, but it's more than an anecdote. When Kissinger got off the plane, Chou Enlai was at the foot of the plane to meet his American counterpart, because Chou Enlai was both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he said to Kissinger, "Oh, I was wondering whether you'd shake my hand or not." And why would he say that? Because a few years earlier, in 1954, Chou Enlai, the same, who was already the Minister of Foreign Affairs, met in Geneva for the negotiation in Indochina a man called Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State of Eisenhower. And Chou Enlai went to him and to shake his hand, and Foster Dulles said, "No, I cannot." Which was, and then of course, you look stupid when somebody's refusing to shake your hand. So interesting, the dialectics of the received handshake or the refused handshake, but it of course hides what is crucial: the fact that what is behind all that. As you said, there is the onset of a long mutual dependence, and that political and economic. The American thought that this political and economical dependence would turn China into a rational and useful partner. But what do we miss beyond what's been shown by Tiananmen, these social upheavals? What we don't see is that globalization is being constructed. And the Americans think that by throwing China into the globalization, to the global world, then China would be tamed, if you like. But what happened is the contrary. China benefited a lot more from globalization than the United States, and the American wager, if you like, failed. And led somehow the United States through Trump or Biden to launch a very anachronistic Cold War. But what was important there was not the chancellery, was not the diplomats, was not the armies. It is the dynamics of globalization that doesn't obey any master. Globalization doesn't obey China, but China has been able to be able to play with or to play globalization better, and for more socioeconomic reasons, China had more to gain from globalization than the US. So that's history, and so it's and someone who's totally off topic, and so who deserves certainly doesn't deserve the bad mark, and that's what the United States. Michael, you were smiling when Bertrand Badi was speaking. 40 years after that encounter, one can see Donald Trump, or Trump, as Bertrand calls him, or one can imagine Joe Biden. We go from one Cold War to another. Is that what you would remember from that episode? What I found fascinating in the rapport between the China and the United States is the forgotten war. It's the Cold War within the Cold War. Because one always think of the Cold War as the United States against USSR, but China was a truly central element of the foreign policy of the US. Marshall, after several meetings with Chou Enlai, has tried to have peace between the troops of Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, but failed, and the US certainly regretted it, because the huge involvement of China in the wars that followed. One forgets that there were 2 million Chinese volunteers in the Korean War who fought, and so it was basically a China-American war, and something that continued with the Vietnam War. So that meeting, I felt, was all the more important that it was the culmination of this Cold War relations, and we can see the effect that this meeting has had. It certainly had repercussions. Conflict that stopped or that ended, but that is being prolonged in other ways. The fact that China entered liberal globalization, the certainty that Americans, or the thought that Americans, that it would generate more democracy in China, that China, by accepting capitalism, would become a democracy or something that would be similar to a democracy, but the Trojan horse was reversed. And Americans are now in a situation where it is China that adapted better to globalization than themselves. So it is fascinating to see how a Cold War situation or a hot war situation could generate that economic war that is still being waged today. Michael, your series is like a chronicle of the 20th century, but at high speed, because a few years later, in 1985, we can see that something that is generating that crack in the Iron Curtain and the fall of the wall. So it's episode 4, the Geneva Summit, 1995. Reagan and Gorbachev meet. So they meet in 1985, something that will generate that falling of the wall. So they meet to try to reduce the nuclear arsenal. In Geneva, the thawing is on its way. In the middle of the Cold War, the two most powerful leaders on the planet are meeting. Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan show great courtesy towards each other, as if the fate of the world depended on it. 20th of November 1985, a simple handshake leads the two countries towards the reduction of their nuclear arsenal. Many see that as a step towards peace, but that peace will be put to the test. In the 80s, Reagan's America is close to winning the Cold War. For 2 years, it's been protected by the Star Wars program. That reminds us of a very famous film. It's a huge space shield that is, in theory, capable of intercepting any ballistic missile from Russia. It's the culmination in the arms race. The Reagan-Gorbachev meeting is another step in nuclear deterrence, but it hides a shift in the balance of power between Americans and Soviets. The US is bogged down in Afghanistan, armed by the United States. The Islamic resistance movements are shooting down more and more Russian helicopters, provoking the defeat of the Soviets. In 1999, military weakened, economically ruined, the USSR is also shaky on a political level. Behind the Iron Curtain, people start to rise. And huge demonstrations for peace is dissolving the Eastern Bloc in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or in East Germany, or in Romania. Demonstrators pillaged the presidential palace that was built in the center of Bucharest. It's the greatest day of our lives, scream Romanians in the streets of Bucharest, is the end of hell for everyone. The fall of the Berlin Wall and communist regimes in Europe precedes the disappearance of the USSR. In 1991, the Cold War is over. A few minutes ago, after the announcement of Mikhail Gorbachev's resignation, when he left his office, the red Soviet flag was lowered down. Gorbachev, who had taken a step towards peace 6 years earlier, let his own people try to go towards freedom. Over 50,000 people will welcome and triumph two simple ideas: freedom and democracy. Bertrand Badi, the red flag that's being lowered, is it a different world? Is it a change from that bipolar world? Are we in a world that is more fragmented, more complicated for peace? It's a bipolar world that is collapsing from the bottom. We should not. There was a lot of ingratitude towards Mikhail Gorbachev. He tried to create a USSR that would live through the cooperation with the West. That's what he said to George W. Bush Sr. And so the bipolarity has disappeared because peoples don't want it anymore. But also, it's not useful to anyone, because the US had the feeling that could win the Cold War just by themselves, and so the Americans humiliated Gorbachev in 1991. They left him waiting for 3 hours, and in the hallway before admitting him into the discussion area with other Western countries. So there is just a unilateral victory. But what I'd like to say is that the 80s, paradoxically, is something else happens that couldn't be shown in this film. But remember, or just know that in 1979, it's the revolution in Iran, and it creates shockwaves all around the Muslim world. It's the civil war in Lebanon, and one of the most destabilizing civil wars in history. Europe is starting to get more familiar, if you like, with a terrorist campaign that's destabilized Western Europe when it was what it had won, the Cold War. And conflicts in Africa are getting more and more frequent. It's the second war in Congo. 6 million dead in Congo is something that nobody talks about. So that fall of a cracked wall is also the fact that new forms of conflicts emerge and peace escapes the leaders of this world.
Michael Gamrasny, we see it in this episode. Tensions are here, 9/11, the Afghanistan or Iraq war. That is the soil of the upcoming conflicts. Another episode covers this issue. We won't view it today, but it will be made available online. And it covers this topic further, but this is another conflict which is rarely covered, that is the Afghanistan war, which was started by the Soviets and was a turning point in this Cold War. We could also say it's a Soviet-Vietnam War. It's tiring the Soviet economy at the time and probably likely tires the society as a whole. So it's the end of a story, although some might question this, the end of Soviet communism. And as you said, The political gesture is a traditional one. Two leaders are meeting, which are very much opposed. And this moment, when you look at the video, when you see it from a media perspective, it looks like a power balance with two leaders, very powerful ones, but some might interpret it as a submission moment. The communist bloc crumbles, the US take over around weaponry, so it's really a crossroad of history. Some might say, but not so often, Gorbachev is doing a very strong political gesture, which is to let his people express itself. After trying this old school moment, he ended up opening a path to something more spontaneous. One word. This image shows, and also doesn't show, that this is already the start of a total victory of the Western world in the Cold War. And what's fascinating here is Gorbachev tried to reform the system. He was not able to. He tried to say, let's move on, to try and save USSR, the empire, which didn't work. But it was truly a shift in history. And in the end, the Cold War ended in almost a non-bloodily way. Of course, there were conflicts, but overall, no one could imagine. Everyone thought that in the long run, the Soviet Union would evolve, but nobody expected to crumble this way. In just a moment, we will have a Q&A session, so don't hesitate to ask your questions in a moment, but let's move on to the other episode that we wanted to show, that is around quite a specific agreement, a historical handshake between Arafat and Rabin, which was supposed to open a way for peace and the creation of a Palestinian state, 1993 in Oslo. You will see in the video that there are different aspects. That's episode number 6 of the web series. At the White House, the audience is waiting for the actors of a scene supposed to put an end to a 45 years conflict in the Middle East. On stage, Prime Minister from Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, and the President of the Liberation of Palestine organization, Yasser Arafat. September 1993. After 8 months of secret negotiations that started in Oslo, the agreements are finally there. The two head of states are finishing a painful and lengthy peace process. But will this peace pass the test? After 27 years of exile, Yasser Arafat is welcomed like the Messiah in the Promised Land. On July the 1st, 1994, in Gaza, he created an autonomous government, the Palestinian Authority, recognized by the Israelis in exchange of him recognizing the Israel state. Potential hope for two independent nations side by side. However, very quickly, in each camp, positions are getting more firm. Jerusalem is reivindicated as capital by Israel and Palestine. The status of the Jewish colonies and the increase in terrorism. Within just 2 years, the Oslo agreements are already bitten by both sides' extremists. And in November 1995, Yitzhak Rabin died, killed by a fanatic. The left makes room to the right of Israel The figure is Benjamin Netanyahu. Israelis and Palestinians do not respect the Oslo agreements anymore, and the second intifada puts an end to the last hopes. It's a new increase in violence hitting Israel, a new cycle of repression starting in Palestine. The Israelis blame Arafat for this, but they have difficulty stopping the influence of Hamas, that is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brothers, against peace. They take power after the death of the last person to sign the Oslo agreements in 2004. Oslo was supposed to secure the safety of Israelis and open the path for a free and independent state of Palestine. But the extremists took over, the two people separated by a wall, delaying the hope for peaceful coexistence. Episode number 6 of the web series available on The Village and on the Forum website, directed by Michael Gamrazi, edited by Kevin Akkar. It's now time for our Q&A session. Bertrand Badi, Marc Semo, and Michael are available to answer your question, Michael Gamrazi, to answer the questions that this viewing may have triggered in the audience. One first question. Hello. I would like to talk about the Chinese-American episode. You probably cannot read the future, but how do you interpret what happened with the submarine crisis between the US, France, and Australia in this Pacific area that does not live in peace? I'm sure Mr. Badi won't answer. Marc Semo? We could say a lot, but this is off topic. I don't think so, because this is the continuation of what you said earlier, this Chinese-American war taking over globalization. It's another debate, but we can see how China, from Xiaoping, who used to say, don't shine too much, don't show yourself, take time, has become more and more powerful. There was no longer a Soviet threat thanks to this cooperation with the US. So China has developed with the arrival of Xi Jinping to present China as a superpower, including in the neighboring countries, that is the Chinese war and the islands. And in front of China, we, of course, changed the rationale. China is a partner, but also a rival and potentially a threat, and that's how you should perceive the submarine crisis. Of course, it's a complex issue, but to summarize, one can understand why Australia would rather have their safety guaranteed by the US rather than by France. Beyond, of course, the way this was done, in a very dishonest way, but in the end, it's a new rationale that looks like a Cold War. Australia, it is an English-speaking country that is part of the English-speaking coalition, in a way came home. Maybe we have other questions? It's a different debate. Today we are covering the INA short films, documentaries. The speaker is not using a microphone. I'm not referring to a specific event, but history as a whole. How come as Bertrand Badi is highlighting the participation of people to peace when they don't participate in war, then how come this morning we got a reminder that there is one budget that people want to reduce, that is the defense budget? Then how come is there this race to increase weaponry? I'm not saying that organizations don't take part, but those huge expenditures do raise questions. There's no immediate solution, of course, but I think that would be a sign of hope to kind of reduce this race towards more weaponry. Bertrand Badi? Excuse me, but today we are commenting those short films, which is a progress in understanding peace. So if we start having a general debate around international relations, we're not paying tribute to those productions. And we're not talking about this new approach of peace through footage. With regards to defense budgets, this was said by our friend Jean-Daniel Lévy this morning, there is a deep reflection in society around the true dynamics of peace, in which context NGOs have appeared around peace and war, especially at the end of the 60s when new forms of conflicts appeared. I'm thinking of Biafra, for instance, which showed that this power balance model was disappearing, that we started something different, maybe not more peaceful, but more complex, where the public opinion was involved more. And that's a recurrent topic in those films. And forbidden debates also. How come there's never a debate in France around the use of nuclear weapon? That's extraordinary. Nobody knows what the uses of nuclear weapons is. It's very expensive for the French budget. It is expensive. Very expensive. Especially while we are modernizing the nuclear weaponry. And that is going to cost a lot in the coming years. How come there's no debate about this? Well, simply because there is a serious anti-democratic enterprise to take national defense issues outside of the political debate. There's never a political debate in the National Assembly around this, never during the political campaigns. So there is a separation of a world that is more and more imaginary, inherited from the Cold War, and the actual world, which does not meet traditional reflexes around defense. So wasn't it easier to imagine peace agreements at the time where there were two blocks, either the blue or the red? Wasn't it easier at the time? And doesn't it get more complicated now in a more fragmented world where alliances can vary? Two countries can be partners, but maybe not friends. I'll give a Normandy answer. Yes and no. You're right. It appears more simple in a time that looked more like a chess game. Either you agreed or didn't agree. But this worked in the times of Louis XIV. After the French Revolution, the society started to get involved, which made things more difficult. And over the centuries, especially getting to the 19th century, which is an interesting time. That was the movement of nationalities coming from the society, where the issue was how you can negotiate a movement of societies, and the European Council saw it starting in the Greek independence. And those films are interesting because they show it very well. It's not easy to build peace where it appears obvious. And there are easier paths to peace among societies, and we talked about it a lot this morning. There is also a social multilateralism that is developing. WHO, UNICEF, UNESCO, FAO make peace. I could give more examples. And people don't want to see those peacemakers, but if we help them, that's what Pascal Lamy said about vaccines. He was right. If there was a bold vaccination campaign, we would get closer to peace in a much easier way than during the Cold War. If we accept this massive vaccination campaign the same way it was done during the Cold War for other diseases, we would get there much more easily than nuclear balance, which is an illusion. Well, we didn't get to watch all episodes. Do we have another question? Mr. Badi said at the start of his intervention around the Oslo agreements that it was easier to make peace, or rather he said make peace to better make war. I wanted to understand what he meant by that. About Oslo? I didn't speak about Oslo. No, but I thought I understood at some point that you said, when viewing this film, that it showed that sometimes people made peace to better make war. Yes, because I personally released a book in 1995 called The End of Territories, and there was a chapter about Oslo where I said it couldn't work, simply because all the ingredients were gathered for a bad peace agreement. And the main mistake, which led to the failure that we just watched, that is a so-called pragmatic will, which is absurd, to leave out the most difficult issues. It's like a child doesn't want to eat certain food, so he starts with dessert and it just leaves the table. Well, it's the same. Not making any progress about one of the most sensitive issues in this conflict, that is the status of Jerusalem, is already a failure on chances of peace. The other mistakes was the idea of making peace over time, gradually. That doesn't make sense. The world doesn't stop. When you have a long-term timeline, then what is the reflex of partners? Well, to lock this as much as possible, to get as much benefits as possible in the later stages of negotiation. That's what happened with Camp David, and other negotiation steps started between 1993 and 2001, 2002. I slightly disagree with our friend Michael. I don't believe the extremists on both sides made Oslo fail. I think it's just due to the fact that Oslo put us in a dead end, and the Intifada was not done by the extremists. It was a reaction from the Palestinian society saying, we were fooled, so let's just start the fight again. So we must be very careful, and it's an aspect we didn't cover much, which is important. The peace technique. In negotiations, there are don'ts. Do not delay the most difficult topics. You must set up a framework and make sure it's binding. Those who sign should feel binded because they signed. And the issue with the Oslo agreements is that there was nothing that was binding for anyone. That's why it failed.
Next question. You were talking about micro negotiations that are ruling today war or peace, and I was wondering how we could capture these negotiations, and is it possible to do that, or can one only capture their consequences? Maybe this is off topic, but it refers to something that's very sensitive. The more War and Peace is moving away from leaders to people, basically, the more there is importance given to the local actors. Now, local actors in historical warfare didn't matter. It was the top of the pyramid, the prince that decided, and then negotiated with other princes, or the state would negotiate with other states. But if conflicts, because I don't like the word war in this context, if the new conflicts are more social than political, it means that at the heart of these conflicts are local actors who are suffering from the war. And it's not in the Quai d'Orsay or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that the solution to the Malian conflict will be decided. It is local actors because these conflicts are very dependent on the instability on the crisis, on the decay, of the situation on the ground in Sahel. A village in the Sahel is a village where you don't have enough to eat, and where the main concern of the village leader is to get some supplies. And that's why the village leader will negotiate. And how can you reproach him with negotiating? And when some people very high up say you don't negotiate with terrorists, this is very artificial, and it's meaningless. And it's ignoring what negotiation is. Negotiating is not giving legitimacy. When there's hostage taken in a bank, the police negotiate with the hostage. Doesn't mean that they agree with the people who take the robbers. No, what you want to do is to solve a situation of emergency where people are in danger of dying. And in the Westphalian traditional context, you don't even think about that because you only negotiate with states. States are legitimate, so you talk to states. But today, you don't know at what level the negotiation should take place, but negotiation just does take place anyway. And I hope that will continue to take place because it saves human lives. Just like after the 15th of August 2021, someone said, "Oh, we'll stop supplying aid to Afghanistan." Well, it means that you're sentencing to death thousands of people will die because that prime minister was just only thinking about his own re-election, and that's disgraceful. Good afternoon to you. My question was more on the technical side of formats. Why shorter format? And how did you choose the footage? So we'll ask the director himself, Michael. How do you choose? I want to say that when you write a documentary, the thing you have to be able to do is to leave things out. And of course, whatever documentary you direct, people say, "Oh, why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you show this? Why didn't you show that?" And when you decide to have a format that's set, where you don't have 8 hours, yes, you have to leave things out. So that's the difficulty, but it forces you to make choices and to have an angle. And if you talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is very complex, and you only got 4 minutes to talk about it, yes, you do need to talk about the extremists to simplify things. But yes, it's very difficult. But there's another difficulty, which is the footage. Because sometimes there are situations that you can't find footage of certain scenes, of certain things, and sometimes the image itself, the footage itself, forces us to we want to say something, but the image is showing something else, so we have to change our discourse as well. So yes, it's this story and throwing between the footage and the image and the idea that is at the heart of the work of a documentary maker. And over 4 minutes, it's difficult because you have to make something that's palatable, and because the shorter the film is, the more you need to have something that's easily digestible, understandable, and maybe it can be simpler, or maybe you can have an image and a text that echo each other, and sometimes it's easier not to have a text that echoes the image. Thank you, Michael. And I guess it was even harder for you because you used to very long formats, because you have documentaries that last hours. So the 8 episodes on the web series can be found here at the village or the forum. You can see them on the website. So have a look at them. We had to leave half of them out. There's one on COP21 and one on the Arusha agreements that are quite hard-hitting, but were that are really, really well done. Well, I want to thank you, because I think we have covered a lot of ground today, and I want to resume. And I want to quote Gérald de Gaulle, as you did, who says that treaties are like roses; they only last for an instant. And I think it's an apt conclusion to our debate. Thank you, Bertrand Badi, for shedding light on the theme. Thank you, Marc Semo. And I'll just recall that that Le Monde's supplement is on the Normandy for Peace forum, with an interview of Bertrand Badi, and we won't forget the director of that series, Nicole Gamrasny, who has enabled us to understand these moments of peace better. Thank you to you all. And I want to thank the teams that have made this forum possible, and this enabled us to exchange and discuss. And I'm sure you and enjoy the other debates and conferences you'll be listening to today and tomorrow. And see you very soon.